telepathic communication back in the 80s. And I read their paper. It was never published, for peer review or anything, but it was a very interesting study. They had about, I think it was 9 test subjects. These people had no experience with any kind of telepathic communication. And what they did is hook one person up to an apparatus that monitored what was going on in their brain and transferred that to a person in another room where they could then read what was on their mind. And the way they tested this was with the standard cards they use for psychics, with the triangles and the squares and the squiggly lines and so on. And they had 100% hit rate with 9 people with no experience. And so what they demonstrated in the lab was essentially that it is measurable and it can be transmitted wirelessly in such a way as you can reconfigure the information and understand it. And knowing that was done in 1985, and here we are, 23 years later. The technology hasn't gotten worse; it's gotten better, and the ability to model perhaps is getting to the point where full transfers of information can happen in much different ways. And as a result, I think we need a real serious discussion. The Economist had a cover story back in 2002, May 25th, 2002. It was called, the cover story was Mind Control. And it was a guy with a compass on it, or a safe on his head. And you think about it, and it was discussing the ethics of all of this, because as this technology has evolved, great questions as to what do we do to regulate. Because right now there are no regulations. And this, I think, is perhaps one of the most important areas of science for what it offers mankind. But at the same time, its abuse potential is extraordinary. And there's enough in the open literature now to say, hey, we need a national discussion about this technology on the backdrop of personal privacy and what that means for liberty in the 21st century, because it's a whole different world in terms of how our technologies impact what we are as human beings, and now even fundamentally, perhaps even the way we think.
Well, Nick, with ESP and our ability to have this extrasensory perception, and tune people up, all of us have had these abilities. Strange things happen to us where we are very perceptive. We just need to train ourselves to realize it when it happens.
Right, and here's the thing. In that conference I mentioned, one of the folks that raised this issue was Alexander Kavarain, and that actually breaks down the math. The other was Rosalie Bertell, who's in her, I got to guess she's in her late 70s, but she's been at this a long time. She used to teach mathematics to PhD students at Berkeley in biological sciences, and she's a very brilliant person, has a long history of working with radiological issues internationally, and her suggestion was that this is the next evolution of human consciousness, that these perceptions, these capabilities are what's coming to us as sort of a natural attribute of our humanity. Another person that I've been working with, a friend of mine, we're actually going to publish his work on ESP, Enhancing Your Potentials, Richard Allen Miller's work, and what he's done and had done early on in the 70s. He was working for the Mankind Research Organization, which we talk about in our book. He was their Northwest field director, and one of his projects was to train 4,000 servicemen and women to enhance their intuition. And they did some pre-testing and then post-testing, and they were able to do this by like an average of 400%, right guessing. And when you think about all of that, the idea that, it's really a matter of exercise, of understanding how the brain's operating and creating an environment where it operates more efficiently. And this is where the discoveries in some of the techniques for enhancing human performance have developed. In the old days, you spent 20 years learning how to meditate, and today you can learn the same thing with techniques in as little as a month. So I think the technologies that are here now, that are becoming more widespread, are actually offering opportunities to open some of this up. And telepathy as a concept, think about telepathy. On one level, I think we do this, people say it's body language. I think it's more subtle than that, how we actually communicate. But imagine if the day arrived where that spontaneously was a possibility for all of us. Sure would make government honest in a hurry, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it sure would. Last week, our guest, who's been on the program with us, Rupert Sheldrake, was wounded when he was stabbed in the leg in Santa Fe. Were you there?
I was there. I was at the same conference.
Did you see the guy, the person who stabbed him?
No, I didn't see that individual. Actually, I had left. I just had breakfast with Rupert and a cup of coffee in the morning, and he was off to get ready for his lecture, and we actually left early. I went down to see Richard Hoagland and Robin. So I spent that day with them. We got the call while we were down there, and it was somebody hearing voices, apparently. And, this is not unusual. People...
And that's why I bring this up. I mean, Rupert was there to talk about mind and consciousness.
Yes.
This other guy who's whacked out is hearing these voices in his head.
Right. And actually, Rupert was at the point of discussing this very topic of telepathy. And he was talking about a technique of gazing in another person's eyes. And I've used this also in my presentations, only in a different context. When you gaze in someone's eyes, particularly if it's someone that you're in love with, what happens is your brains begin to synchronize. They begin to follow in a way that they actually are resonating with a higher frequency of correlation, where things are matching out, if you will. It's almost like a frequency following response, if you will. What it does is it means that, when you're in harmony, when you're in resonance, two or more gathered together, I mean, all these basic kind of concepts that come through so many different ways actually has a physical counterpart. And in this particular case, that's what he was lecturing on, was this idea of gazing and then being able to appreciate the other person's awareness, maybe even very specifically in terms of the telepathic communication. And I think that's an interesting concept. And people have all experienced, I think, at some level, some unusual, anomalous communication. I give you mine from Germany, if I can.
Sure.
I travel to Germany, once or twice a year for many years, and I don't speak German, never took a German class, and I'll interact with my friends from time to time, and they're speaking German, and I can somehow perceive it. And I always chalked it up to body language and just being around them a lot and that kind of thing. And then I was relaying this to friends of mine in Switzerland, and then we were all driving, and we got a flat. And everybody's talking about the flat. And I interject, no, don't use a pocket knife, you'll just break the blade. They all stopped and looked at me and said, how did you know we were talking about that? I said, you're speaking English. I said, no, we're speaking German. But I heard every word in English. I didn't hear any German. And it was the most unusual.
That's weird.
Yeah, very unusual. But I thought about it. It made me think about this underlying level of communication that actually is taking place. The words maybe are some kind of carrier that we identify with, but perhaps communication happens at a much deeper level, and I think that's probably true.
Well, there's no doubt. You've got that ability to break down communication and decipher it.
Yeah, and I've seen, some things that are pretty compelling in this area in my lifetime. And then when I see my friends, I mean, Alex Kavarainen is probably, as I said, one of the most brilliant biophysicists on the planet. And his formulations and his consideration of all of this is based on over 50 years of real serious work. And when I think about it, I think that's maybe that's Judgment Day. I mean, could you imagine if we had that capability, whether it was augmented by some synthetic capacity, whether it be something like a telephone, or what have you? I mean, they're talking about handheld lie detectors, right? I mean, we're talking about the ultimate question mark is
exactly,
should we, because we can, and if we do, what should we think about this? And whether it's natural or augmented by man, who should decide? And these are all big questions that are not in some far-off next generation's decision matrix. They're in ours. And I think this administration, particularly, as we look at what's coming politically in the country, we have, I think this generation, this next couple of elections are going to be critical to where our technology takes us. And it has the potential to free us to incredible potentials, or the opposite, to enslave us in a way that limits what we're capable of. I mean, just the agitation, the fear and worry of the economy, the news, how it comes at you, the advertisements of smelling bad, tasting bad, I mean, whatever they're telling you, as negative messages, being hit with this sort of underlying worry